I thought this episode felt a lot more like the first 5 than it did last week's episode. We were talking about it settling into more of a Game of Thrones rhythm of the life and times of these people crossing over with each other's storylines.
Mm-hmm.
But this one was all big events and gatherings and felt like that greatest hits structure that we talked about for the first 5. And I looked into it a little because we read that interview last week with Ryan Condal saying that season 2 is not going to do big time jumps anymore. Apparently, next week's episode, which is episode 8, is the last big time jump, and it's 6 years.
Whoa.
Oh.
And then after that, we settle down. So we're going to age up the kids. I mean, you
6
have to for
years.
most of them. But like
Wow.
zooming out, so these are the time jumps between episodes for these 8 that we have to talk about. 6 months, 3 years, 1 year, 1 month, 10 years, 1 month, 6 years.
Wow.
So it's like 20-ish years that we're covering in the first season,
Yeah.
and then it settles down. And I was worried that might feel strange, that like pacing shift into season 2. But then I realized I've spent the last year talking about The Witcher, and The Witcher does this perfectly because we have the short stories that jump all around the timeline, and then the story settles into this linear, novelistic timeline.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
at
it
this
makes
point,
sense.
like House of the Dragon's going to do a better Witcher adaptation than the show.
Yeah. Well, and even this episode, like I see what you're saying about how it felt more like the first episodes of House of the Dragon, of it kind of feeling like a greatest hits, but it also takes place over the course of 12 hours?
This
like
episode?
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
it's not a long time because it's really just Lena's funeral that night and then I guess the next day or two. Like it's pretty quick, but you're right
Yeah.
that just the way it's not in terms of time covered, but just its structure and its feel and its pacing are a lot more like that.
The last couple of weeks, I've been listening to the first Game of Thrones audiobook a bit. And settling back into the rhythm of that story, you cover time so slowly. You cover, I mean, every single chapter has a blockbuster, like really exciting event in it. Even if it's not The Watchers on the Wall or Hard Home, it's really exciting for that character.
Sure.
It's a really gorgeously written story, but you cover time so slowly that you see people think and chew on things. And I've been trying to zoom out and really understand this world better because we keep changing actors and moving forward so many years. I wonder if this greatest hits approach almost makes a claim about history while obscuring that claim. I want to know what you guys think of this.
Okay.
Mainly, it's that there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of time for brooding and pouting and begrudging others. Basically, there are a lot of pulled punches. And what we see every week in this greatest hits of this show, it's like the calcified explosion of those grievances. Like the way it almost make more sense for me why these characters seem to age so fast and so roughly, because they've been poisoned by spite and resentment.
Sure.
Comparing this Allison to the one we met a month and a half ago. Like, if I think about her character, I understand it, even if it seems like a crazy escalation on the surface. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that the time jumps have really served to help that because sort of I feel like a big part of the issue with, I mean, the obvious comparison, right, is Daenerys in Game of Thrones. We saw her, we grew up with her from season 1, but then by the time the last season, what is it, 8?
Yes.
Rolled around, and we got to see her do her heel turn for like 2 episodes. People felt robbed because we saw it happen and we saw like the subtle changes in her character over time. And we, yes, I can take the logical steps to see how she might get there given those experiences. But it almost, leaving it to the imagination makes these jumps more believable because with all of the time and the experiences, just like the ones that we get to see, countless numbers of them having happened, that would just occur off screen, right? You can sort of suspend your disbelief and understand, okay, well, maybe, after 15 or so of these events, that's how this character gets entrenched in this position, versus growing up with someone as your hero character, maybe your self-insert, the one you're rooting for, and then all of a sudden they go off the deep end. That feels hollow. That feels like you've been robbed of something.
Yeah. Well, and
versus
sorry. Well, I feel like Danny's arc is more suited to something like this show I think of that like jumping through time because I mean in the books, I mean I haven't read all the books, but from what I know and have read, there are like I think like Clash of Kings, there are like 4 Danny chapters. Like not as much is happening with her, but the show doesn't want you to forget about Danny, so they had to kind of like fill the time and kind of create things for her to do, for her story to make sense and for us to not forget that she exists as a character, not go 4 episodes going, where on earth is Danny? But so I think her arc makes more sense for a structure like this show. And I think maybe that's also why her turn is so jarring for some people, because she hasn't had like loads and loads and loads and loads of screen time and story the way that someone like Tyrion had, you know? And so it's like, what, she was this like victim child bride, and then she freed some slaves and now she's killing people. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but it's because she's just had a different, her story structure is different from the others.
But also, the more we learn about this twisted, incestuous, evil family, I mean, the Targaryens are by far the most evil family in Westeros. It used to be the Lannisters, but that looks almost like a sitcom now.
Sure.
I love that. I love what they've done with Jason Lannister.
Oh, he's fun. He's so funny.
The more episodes we have of this show, I think the more believable Dany's... And I'm one of the people who thought... I totally believed her turn in the Bells. Totally believed it, and I thought they built up to it okay. In the same way the last seasons were a little rushed. I think that applies to every storyline, not really anymore to Dany.
Sure.
But every week I see more from Daemon and Viserys and Alicent and all these people.
Yeah.
I more believe Dany's turn.
Like oh, I get it.
They're building out how rough that family is.
Because I think, because when you watch or read Game of Thrones, the literal only Targaryens you get to see are Viserys and Dany. And Viserys is like unhinged batshit crazy, right? And the only other Targaryen you hear about is the Mad King, who was unhinged batshit crazy. And so you assume that, well, Dany's not like that, so why would she all of a sudden turn when you're seeing, like, versus like the Targaryens in House of the Dragon that are not totally unhinged off the walls, but they are bad people, you know? And so you kind of see that more nuanced take on a Targaryen. Yeah.
But even following young Rhaenyra and young Alicent, that whole conflict, they weren't what they are now back then.
No.
So if we'd been following them at that more glacial pace, we wouldn't have believed what we just saw in this week's episode.
Sure, right.
So maybe when you go from that glacial, more prose-like pacing to this greatest hits thing, when you make that jump, I think you lose causation. And that's what people complain about for Game of Thrones. Yeah. But now that we're starting here, we'll sort of believe anything. I mean, Rhaenyra's had like 3 husbands in 3 episodes, and it's fine.
And you're like, okay, that's cool.
Daemon has
and
killed
you're like,
3
Team
wives.
Rhaenyra.
Yeah, it's
go for her.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting the way that these characters are so different from Game of Thrones, and it's interesting to see just how our opinions have changed.